You know, it's kind of wild when you think about it. We walk around totally dependent on all these devices, these signals,
Mm.
and we can't even see them.
Mm-hmm.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? About this whole invisible world of electromagnetic frequencies, EMFs, just humming along in our daily lives.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've gathered some really interesting material here looking at how we use these frequencies, what we know about the effects, how they're regulated, even a bit of the history.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
Our goal really is to try and cut through some of that complexity, sort of boil it down to what you actually need to know about all the frequencies buzzing around you.
Right.
Have you ever just stopped and thought about all those unseen waves,
Yeah.
the ones constantly interacting with you?
It's a great question to kick things off with, because we really are swimming in this sea of information, and, well, sometimes it feels like maybe a sea of worry, too,
Yeah.
about these EMFs.
Yeah.
So let's get right to maybe a core concern people have,
Mm-hmm.
which is so many different frequencies out there. Is the sheer number something we should worry about?
Exactly. You might think, okay, I've got my phone, my Wi-Fi, the TV signals, everything.
Mm-hmm.
Does it all just add up? Is there a point where it's just, I don't know, too much for our bodies, an overload?
It's interesting. What the science suggests is that it's less about, counting how many different frequencies there are,
Okay.
and much more about the individual characteristics of each one.
Right.
Think of it like being at a concert, lots of different instruments playing.
Right.
What really matters isn't just how many instruments there are total, it's how loud each one is playing,
Mm-hmm.
how close you happen to be standing to, say, the speakers or a specific instrument, and the type of sound it's making. A gentle flute versus a really booming bass drum.
Yeah, very different impact.
Exactly. And it's similar with EMFs. It's the intensity that's the power of the signal, your proximity to the source, and crucially, the type of frequency. Those factors really dictate the potential effects.
Okay, so quality over quantity, kind of. That makes a lot more sense. And you mentioned different types. That word radiation, it can sound a bit alarming. Can we break that down? What does it actually mean here?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a loaded term sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But when we talk about electromagnetic radiation, we generally group it based on its energy level, and that's directly tied to its frequency.
Okay.
The two main buckets are non-ionizing and ionizing radiation. Now, ionizing radiation,
Yeah.
that's things like UV rays from the sun, X-rays, gamma rays. They have a high enough frequency, enough energy, to actually knock electrons out of atoms and molecules.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that can break chemical bonds, damage our DNA. That's why we know it can be harmful. Think of it like a tiny, tiny wrecking ball at the atomic level.
Right, and like you said, sunburn, we feel that directly. That's the UV radiation doing its thing.
Precisely. Now, the other bucket, non-ionizing radiation, this includes the lower frequency EMFs we're mostly talking about today.
Like our phones and Wi-Fi.
Exactly. Radio waves, microwaves, the frequencies from phones, Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
But these generally don't have enough energy per particle, let's say, to cause that direct DNA damage. At least not at the typical levels we encounter day to day. It's more like a gentle nudge compared to that wrecking ball.
That's a really helpful picture. Okay, so let's focus on these non-ionizing ones then, the everyday background frequencies. What are some of the constant ones we're all exposed to, especially, say, in towns and cities?
Oh, we are definitely living amidst a constant hum, particularly in urban areas. I mean, just start with the electricity powering everything. Power lines operate at a very low frequency, usually 50 or 60 hertz. That's ELF. Extremely low frequency.
Okay, very low.
Then you've got broadcast radio. AM stations are down in the kilohertz range. FM radio is higher up in the megahertz range. TV signals also use megahertz frequencies.
So it's like this huge spectrum of signals.
It really is. Think of it like a radio dial, just vastly expanded. Lower down, you have power lines, AM radio. Move up, you get FM, TV.
And then all the wireless stuff we use constantly, right? Our smartphones.
Yeah.
They're always talking back and forth.
Always. Phones typically use frequencies from around 700 megahertz up to maybe 2.7 gigahertz, depending on the network and what they're doing.
And Wi-Fi?
Wi-Fi primarily uses the 2.4 gigahertz and the 5 gigahertz bands.
Yeah.
And the newer Wi-Fi 7 is starting to use the 6 gigahertz band, too, for even faster speeds.
Right.
Bluetooth, for your headphones, keyboards, that also hangs out in the 2.4 gigahertz range.
Okay.
Even your microwave oven. It's designed to keep the energy inside, of course, but it operates at 2.45 gigahertz.
Yeah.
There can sometimes be tiny amounts of leakage, usually very minor.
Interesting.
And we can't forget GPS. That uses frequencies around 1.2 to 1.5 gigahertz to figure out where you are. And then, of course, 5G, which are more complex. It uses a whole range of frequencies, from lower bands around 600 megahertz, similar to older mobile tech, all the way up to well over 40 gigahertz in some high-speed, short-range applications.
Wow, yeah, when you list them all like that, it really hits home how saturated our environment is with these signals.
Hmm.
Now, we made that clear distinction, ionizing, potentially harmful, versus non-ionizing, generally lower risk at typical levels. But even within that non-ionizing range, are there specific frequencies or situations that maybe raise more eyebrows than others?
That's a good question. Within the non-ionizing spectrum, the main concern, if you really crank up the power, shifts away from DNA damage towards heating effects.
Heating.
Yeah, tissue heating. Think about high-power industrial radar systems, or like we mentioned, a microwave oven that's seriously malfunctioning and leaking a lot. That level of power can definitely heat biological tissue.
Okay, that makes sense.
There have also been some suggestions, though the scientific evidence here is really not firm, not conclusive, linking very long-term exposure to those extremely low-frequency fields from power lines.
The 50, 60 hertz ones?
Right. Linking that to maybe a slightly increased risk of childhood leukemia.
Yeah.
But I'd really have to stress the science on that is still debated and not considered proven by most major health organizations.
That nuance is so important. Okay, so flipping the coin then.
Yeah.
Are there frequencies on the spectrum that are actually being looked at or even used for potentially good things, for health benefits? It can't all be potential risks, surely.
Not at all. And this is where it gets really fascinating. Certain frequencies are actually showing real promise in therapeutic uses.
Like what?
Well, for example, infrared therapy. It uses infrared light that's a lower frequency electromagnetic wave, just beyond visible light, to help with things like pain relief and promoting healing.
Okay.
Then there's low-level laser therapy, LLLT. It uses specific wavelengths of light, again, a form of EM energy, to potentially help with tissue repair. And there's also something called pulsed electromagnetic field therapy, or PEMF. It's still quite experimental in many areas, but it's being investigated for a whole range of things, like potentially helping bones heal faster, or even as a possible treatment for depression.
Wow.
So it highlights this really interesting duality, doesn't it? The same fundamental energy we sometimes worry about can also potentially be harnessed for healing. It really suggests that the application, the intensity, the way it's used, that's absolutely key, not just the wave itself.
That's a great way to put it. The intention and the power level really matter. Okay, so looking ahead now, what's on the horizon? What new or emerging frequency technologies should we maybe be aware of?
Oh, the field is definitely moving fast. We're already hearing about the development of 6G technology.
Beyond 5G already.
Yep. And it's expected to use even higher frequencies than much of 5G, potentially pushing up into the terahertz range.
Yeah.
That's even higher than the millimeter waves used in some 5G. Yeah, it sits on the spectrum between microwaves and infrared light. And using those frequencies naturally brings up new questions about long-term effects that will need careful study as the tech develops.
Sure.
Terahertz communication itself is being explored for potentially incredibly high-speed data transfer, probably over shorter distances.
Okay.
Then there's some really cool work in ambient RF energy harvesting.
Harvesting, like grabbing it out of the air?
Kind of. The idea is to capture some of the radio waves already floating around us and convert them into tiny amounts of usable electricity, maybe enough to power small sensors or devices without batteries.
Huh, interesting.
There's also research into quantum radio, using principles of quantum entanglement for potentially ultra-secure communication. Still very much research level, though.
Sounds like sci-fi.
A little bit. And as we touched on, Wi-Fi 7 is rolling out, expanding into that 6 gigahertz band for faster, more reliable wireless internet in our homes and offices.
So lots happening, but you also mentioned potential areas for caution with some newer tech. Are there specific ones we should be paying maybe a bit closer attention to as they become more common?
Well, millimeter wave 5G, the part that uses those higher frequencies, say 24 gigahertz up to 40 gigahertz or more, that's one area that definitely warrants continued attention and research.
Why specifically that range?
Well, while it's still non-ionizing, these higher frequencies behave a bit differently. They don't penetrate the body as deeply as lower frequencies. They tend to be absorbed more superficially, like in the skin.
Okay.
And because they haven't been used as widely for consumer tech before, the long-term data on potential health effects is just, well, it's more limited compared to, say, the frequencies used for radio or older mobile phone generation.
Right, less history.
Exactly. So questions come up about, cumulative exposure as these networks potentially become much denser with more small cell antennas around, and just the general lack of really long-term studies on those specific frequencies.
Makes sense.
Another area to consider is the rise of devices we keep in really close proximity to our bodies for long periods.
Like smartwatches, wireless earbuds.
Precisely. Even if the power output of each device is quite low, the fact that they're often worn for many hours a day right against the skin,
Hmm.
that constant, very close contact is a different exposure scenario than, say, a Wi-Fi router across the room.
Yeah, that changes the equation, doesn't it?
It potentially does. So it raises questions about localized exposure over time that researchers are looking into.
Okay. It makes me wonder then, have there ever been cases where certain frequencies were just deemed too risky, like actually banned or removed from use?
That's an interesting point.
Yeah.
There have definitely been situations where the use of specific frequencies, particularly at very high power levels, has been heavily restricted or controlled because of known hazards.
Like what?
Well, obvious examples are things like radar systems or microwave weapons, which operate at extremely high power. Those are under very strict military control for safety reasons.
Wow.
And sometimes certain frequencies that were maybe used for older military or even some medical applications might get phased out or abandoned, maybe due to safety updates, or sometimes just because they caused interference with newer, more critical communication systems.
Okay.
And of course, as we discussed, the use of ionizing radiation X-rays, CT scans, is very tightly regulated. We know the risks there, so exposure is minimized according to strict guidelines.
But what about the everyday stuff? Like, has Wi-Fi or cell phone frequencies ever been banned anywhere?
That's the key distinction. No electromagnetic frequencies that are in widespread use for consumer technologies like phones, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, have been outright banned based on established health risks at their typical operating levels. What we do have are regulations and guidelines
Set by who?
by international bodies like ICNIRP, that's the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, and national regulators like the FCC in the U.S., or similar agencies elsewhere. And the World Health Organization also provides guidance. These bodies set exposure limits.
So it's about managing exposure, setting limits, not really banning the tech itself.
Exactly. It's based on the current scientific understanding of risks, primarily related to heating effects at higher exposures for non-ionizing frequencies.
Okay. That brings up an interesting point then. Do we, as the public, have any real say in how these frequencies get used? Or how new tech like 5G gets rolled out in our neighborhoods?
Yeah, where does the public voice fit into all this? It's complex. On one hand, the primary job of managing the radio spectrum falls to those regulatory bodies, and their decisions often involve a lot of technical details, economic factors, balancing different needs.
Sure.
However, there are mechanisms for public input. Sometimes there are public consultations before major deployments, like for new mobile network generations.
So people can comment.
They can, although the process varies. And, ultimately, while many decisions are quite technical, if there's significant public concern, or if compelling new scientific data emerges regarding safety, that can influence things. It can lead to further reviews, maybe adjustments in regulations or deployment plans. It's not always a direct line, but public awareness and engagement can definitely play a role in the conversation.
So it's this interplay between the tech, the regulators, and public awareness. That makes sense. Now, just to help demystify some of the tech we use every single day, could you give us maybe a quick, understandable rundown of how things like, say, digital TV or Bluetooth or Wi-Fi actually work using these frequencies?
Sure thing. The basic idea behind most of these wireless technologies is actually pretty similar. You take digital information, ones and zeros,
Right.
and you encode it onto an electromagnetic wave, a radio wave usually. You modulate the wave in a specific way to carry that code. Then you transmit it through the air. And on the other end, you have a receiver, your TV, your phone, your laptop, that's designed to pick up that specific frequency and decode the signal, turning it back into the original information, whether that's video, audio, or data.
So it's like sending a message in a special code using radio waves as the messenger.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
For digital TV, for instance, the video and audio are compressed and encoded onto radio waves, usually in the UHF or VHF bands. Your TV has a tuner that knows how to listen for those specific frequencies and decode that particular language.
Got it. What about Bluetooth? That always seems kind of magic, connecting headphones instantly.
Yeah, the Bluetooth is clever. It operates in that busy 2.4 gigahertz band, the same one used by some Wi-Fi and microwave ovens. To avoid interference, it uses a technique called frequency hopping.
Hopping.
Yeah, imagine lots of people trying to talk in the same room.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of sticking to one spot and potentially talking over someone, Bluetooth quickly jumps between many different narrow channels within that 2.4 gigahertz band, like hundreds of times per second. This makes it much less likely to clash with other signals and helps create a more stable connection for your devices.
That makes so much sense. And Wi-Fi is similar, just encoding data.
Pretty much. Wi-Fi uses the 2.4, 5, and now 6 gigahertz bands. It takes your internet data, modulates it onto radio waves, and beams it out from your router for your devices to pick up over a relatively short range. It's all based on that core principle: encoding, transmitting, and decoding digital info using EM waves.
Amazing how it all works invisibly around us. Looking back a bit further, how did we even figure all this out? It's not like we always knew about radio waves, right?
Oh, absolutely not. For a long time, it was just a theory. Our modern understanding really kicked off in the 1860s. There was a physicist, James Clerk Maxwell.
Heard the name.
Yeah, a giant in physics. He developed a mathematical theory that predicted the existence of electromagnetic waves, waves that travel at the speed of light. But it was just theory then.
So who proved it?
That was Heinrich Hertz in the late 1880s. Around 1886 to 1889, he conducted experiments that actually generated and detected these radio waves in his lab, proving Maxwell's theory was correct.
So hertz is why we measure frequency in hertz.
Exactly, a tribute to his discovery. And the very first practical use, that came pretty quickly afterwards with long-wave radio communication, using frequencies below 300 kilohertz. That was really the dawn of our wireless age, sending messages without wires across distances.
Incredible. From theory to experiments to long-wave radio in just a few decades. That's amazing progress. Okay, so finally, we've talked about potential risks, exciting possibilities, regulations, but moving beyond speculation or, individual claims, what adverse effects from frequency exposure have actually been scientifically documented and confirmed?
Right, separating the established effects from the ongoing debates. There are definitely some documented adverse effects, microwave injuries, for instance. These are primarily burns or tissue damage caused by the heating effect of very high-power microwave radiation.
Okay, but that's high power like industrial or military settings.
Yes, typically confirmed in occupational or military settings where people might have been exposed to unusually strong microwave sources, maybe accidentally.
Got it. What about things like electromagnetic hypersensitivity?
That's a tricky one. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or EHS, is a condition where people report experiencing a variety of symptoms, headaches, fatigue, dizziness, that they attribute to exposure to everyday EMF levels. However, rigorous scientific studies, particularly double-blind tests where neither the participant nor the researcher knows if a real EMF source is active. Those studies have generally not been able to show a consistent, direct causal link between EMF exposure and the reported symptoms. The symptoms are real for the people experiencing them, absolutely, but the link to EMF hasn't been scientifically established.
Okay, so the cause isn't confirmed to be EMF. What else?
Well, there's the phenomenon often called Havana syndrome, affecting diplomats and personnel primarily. Some investigations have pointed towards directed energy, possibly microwaves, as a potential cause, but it's still under active investigation and there's no definitive conclusion yet.
Right, still a mystery in many ways.
And then there's some older research, going back decades, that looked at radar technicians who had prolonged occupational exposure to high levels of microwaves. Some of those studies indicated an increased risk of developing cataracts in the eyes.
Okay.
So yes, while some claims like EHS lack robust scientific confirmation linking them directly to EMF, there are documented biological effects, particularly associated with high-intensity exposure or specific circumstances like the suspected directed energy cases.
It really underscores that need for nuance, doesn't it? Okay, this has been incredibly insightful, a really helpful deep dive. To try and wrap things up, what would you say are the most important messages you'd want people listening to take away about EMFs in their daily lives?
I think the absolute key takeaway is that understanding EMFs really requires that nuanced perspective we've been talking about. It's not just about how many frequencies are around you.
Right.
It's critically about the intensity, the power level, how close you are to the source, and the specific type of frequency. Remember that fundamental difference between low-frequency, non-ionizing radiation at everyday levels and high-frequency ionizing radiation like X-rays or strong UV. They interact with our bodies in fundamentally different ways.
Yeah.
And while some frequencies show promise for medical uses, others, especially at very high power or maybe with constant, very close contact from devices, definitely warrant our continued attention and ongoing research.
Exactly. It's really about building an informed understanding, isn't it? Recognizing the differences, being mindful of our exposure, rather than just feeling overwhelmed by this invisible world. We really hope this deep dive has helped shed some light on what can be a pretty complex topic, and maybe giving you a clearer picture of the electromagnetic world we all navigate. And maybe just a final thought to leave you with. As we keep innovating, keep introducing new frequency based technologies, what responsibility do we all have, really, in understanding the potential long term impact on ourselves and on our environment? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining us for this exploration.